tomorrow's the first day of fall, so as we make the transition into a cooler season, we have to make a couple of changes to our collections. These tips apply whether you're growing indoors or outdoors, on a windowsill, under grow lights. There's a couple of adjustments as growers that we need to make sure that our orchids are set up for success. So in today's video, I'm going to share some things that you have to keep in mind as we transition seasons. So let's just get right into it. So let's talk about light. So as we head into fall, the days are going to be shorter. So those of you who grow your orchids on windowsills are going to notice that you're going to get less hours of light for your plants. Depending on what exposure you have, you may have to supplement with additional light. So you may have to consider getting a grow light. Now, of course, this depends on your light source, your window exposure, and so on, but just something to keep in mind. If you grow under grow lights, what I personally like to do is I take my grow lights and I shorten the time that they receive light. So in the summer, I give them 14 hours a day, and in the winter, I taper that back to 12. So right now, I'll give them about 13 hours or I'll just go straight to 12, but you want to reduce it. And the point of that is that in the wild, orchids also get a little bit less light during this time. Between summer and winter, some species orchids, they get a little bit of variability, and the light is actually a factor in some of them blooming. So I taper back in the fall. So this weekend, I'm going to set my timers to run probably from 7 in the morning to 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. at night and leave it like that. This applies to outdoor and indoor growers both, but there's going to be a temperature drop, obviously, as we head into the fall. So you want to make sure that any hot growers or anything that require warmer temperatures are away from any drafts. If you have open windows, you just want to keep that in mind. If you grow indoors, your radiators are going to start kicking on soon, so you want to make sure you move your plants from your radiators. I actually had a plant that I burned a couple of years ago because on the first day of heating season, I wasn't expecting the radiator to come on and it burned my plant. So something to keep in mind. If you have cymbidiums or nobiles or anything that requires cooler temperatures, now's a good time to get them outside. I have a couple of nobile orchids. I actually put them out in my fire escape since they like the cooler temperatures this time of year. So it's just all about making adjustments, making sure that your warm growers are nice and warm, making sure that any deciduous orchids or anything that requires a cooler temperature, they can get exposed to outdoor temperatures now that it's fall. But you want to be mindful, depending on where you live, that they're not getting any frost. Orchid care is individual per species, so it depends on the care of that specific orchid. For nobiles in general, they just have to be, I would say, above 40 degrees. You just don't want them to freeze. So this time of year, I find that they benefit from getting cooler temperatures. So I'm going to take them out of this grow space and get them outside into my fire escape. Not the best way, but if you're in an apartment, that's the best you can do to get some temperature variability. Of course, humidity now. We're going from summertime here in New York where humidity is sometimes 80%, and now it's going to drop to 30, 40%, even 20% in the winter. So what that means is that you're going to get more issues with spider mites sometimes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flush my collection this weekend. Well, I'm going to do it all week. This takes a long time. I have these here and I have another set of grow shelves right over there. So I'm going to flush my collection and I'm going to treat everything. So as it gets drier, I've noticed that spider mites do start creeping up. So because that humidity is coming down, because the temperature is dropping, they kind of go hand in hand sometimes. I just want to do a preventative measure so that everything's okay. I'm getting ahead of any issues. So it's always good practice. I like to do it between every season. Obviously, it's preferable to flush monthly. I try to. I don't always have the time to. As we transition into fall, it's very important, I think, to just get ahead of it, and I'm going to just treat the entire collection preventatively. It's also a good time to get your humidifier out. It's not required. I don't think humidity is the biggest factor in having success with orchids, but if you have very, very dry conditions, a humidifier can make it more, make it a better environment for your orchid. I don't think it's required. Sometimes I don't even take mine out, but I do have a couple of humidifiers, one that's really big for this room, and it's a good time to get it out if you like humidifiers, if your conditions are extra dry. Otherwise, I come in with my electric pump sprayer, and I spray things in the morning, and it's generally fine. But it's not required. It's just like that extra push, the extra thing that can be helpful to orchids, but it's not one of the most important in my opinion. Okay, watering changes, thank goodness, because in the summer I just can barely keep up, but because it's going to be cooler, because it's going to be drier, depending on where you live, less water is needed for your orchids. So you're going to water less often, and you're going to fertilize less often. So in the summer, I like to use full strength fertilizer. In the fall, I taper that back to half strength, quarter strength, and in the winter, I barely use any at all. It really depends on how you prefer to water your orchids or fertilize them. Some people like to do a heavy fertilizing monthly. I like the more weekly sort of approach. So when I say full strength, I would probably say that I just look at the label and see what they say and then divide it by what it would be for the 2 weeks or the month. Every fertilizer is different. There's no wrong way. You just don't want to over or under fertilize. But in the fall, it's time to taper that back. As for watering, you don't really want to water on a schedule, because if you have a big collection like I do, you have pots that are bigger, you have pots that are smaller, so they're all going to dry differently. So I would water as these pots dry. This time of year, I think I can get away with watering every 5 days. However, I don't water everything. I just come in here and see what needs it. I have a lot in moss. I have some stuff in barks. I still have some things in Leca, so it goes on a pot by pot basis. But I find that I don't have to water every single day, maybe aside for my catasetums or something like that are still in active growth. And those are going to start going into dormancy very soon. It's important to keep air circulation going. I don't have air circulation hitting the plants like directly, but I do have an oscillating fan here in the corner. You just need some sort of moving air so that you can avoid fungal infections. Nothing with that changes in the fall. Keep that going. Very important for your orchids. Orchids don't like stagnant air. It's a good time to check for pests as well as you're flushing your orchids. You want to make sure that there's nothing in your plants. And I think season by season, it's a great way to just have some peace of mind and get something before it takes over your collection. I never forget that I had a thrips infestation. It happened so quickly, and I had to treat the whole collection. They were all over. It caused a lot of damage. So I constantly check my orchids when I'm flushing them, so it's a good time as well to do that. The next thing that I'll say is kind of important, but gosh, I'm always behind on this, but it's repotting. So now that the temperatures are getting cooler and growths are slowing down, now is not the most ideal time to repot. You can repot when it's not spring or summer. You absolutely can. However, it's not the most ideal time. So if an orchid doesn't look like it needs to be repotted, and let's say you've had it in a pot for 3 years, now's not the time to be like, oh, let me just repot this. No, just let it be, wait for the spring. But the exception to that is if you have orchids that are growing outside of their pots with new roots, that's perfectly acceptable, because those new roots will take over and grow in the new media. So I've repotted things in the fall and winter in the past that had no active roots, and they sulked for a really long time. So now is not the ideal time. If you can get away with waiting until the spring, great. If they have new growths, new root tips, then absolutely you can, but you just have to use your discernment here. New root tips generally will adapt, provided this is if you're growing indoors. If the temperatures are a lot cooler or you grow them outdoors, I wouldn't, because then they're going to slow down. But this is also a case-by-case basis. Like if it's growing outside of its pot, definitely do it. Just like the Cattleya that I repotted last week with you guys, that's an acceptable repot. I repotted some Phalaenopsis with you guys as well. Those were needed. That's going to come in a future video. But if it doesn't need the repot, if it's not climbing out of its pot, if it doesn't have new root tips, just leave it alone and you can repot those in the spring. I think it's also fine to just up pot your orchids because it's less forgiving than the summer and the spring. So if it's growing out of its pot, I think up potting is a good move as well. But yeah. But you could save the bulk of your repots for the spring at this point. I'm personally very, very behind. I'm not happy with that. I was supposed to divide several orchids. I may get to them. Some of them actually do have roots growing out of their pots. They keep growing. They're hybrids. So I'll get those done. But yeah, this was not a good year for me with repots, but in the spring, I will be fully caught up. If deciduous orchids, it's a good time to separate them. So I mentioned my Dendrobium nobilis. In the winter, those don't get any fertilizer. So I take them out of the collection and I prepare to get them outside or away from everything. But I want to separate them because those get no fertilizer and they get a lot less water than the rest of the collection. So that makes my life easier. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If I missed anything, let me know down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.